episode 105. Good morning, cherry trees, full up with blooms, enjoying the sunshine just like me. Do-do-do-do, feeling groovy. Greetings and welcome into the Pawtuxet General. I am your host, Jess. This week our weather has been here, there, and everywhere. And when the sun does shine here in Old Pawtuxet Village, so do the colors. Daffodils are up, forsythia has broken out all over the neighborhood, and we will have berry pies at the pop-up store this week. I'm sure they will sell out as early as last week, so as always, early birds or pre-orders get the pies first. In this episode, however, our recipe is for Rhode Island Native American cornmeal bread, and we will read the finale of Under the Pyramids by H.P. Lovecraft for Harry Houdini. So exciting! But first, I must thank our Patreon subscribers, these bodaciously bold bastions of benevolent background bankrolling in bitsy banking amounts, without whom we would beyond a doubt be bankrupt. So thank you. And if you would like to benefit from becoming one of these beneficent benefactors, simply follow the link in the show notes or check out our page on patreon.com. Until then, thank you. And let's make some yummy cornbread. This is the time of year we get out a little more, with yard work and spring cleaning to do. And then there are those other days, rain-soaked and windy. Well, this local dish is good for both. Something quick for the outside days and comforting enough for the blustery ones. This recipe comes from the Rhode Island Sampler, a local cookbook to raise money for the American Cancer Society in 1988. It was submitted by Lucille Voda, and I bring it to you, some editing involved, the Rhode Island Native American cornmeal bread. I suggest Kenyon Mills cornmeal, like in episode 67. For this recipe, you will need 1 cup Rhode Island white cornmeal, 1 cup of flour, 1/8 teaspoon salt, 2 teaspoons baking powder, 2/3 of a cup sugar, 1 egg beaten, 3/4 of a cup milk, and 1 tablespoon of butter melted. Mix the dry ingredients together in a medium mixing bowl, and then add the egg, milk, and then the butter. Beat by hand until well mixed and light. Spoon into an 8 or 9-inch square greased pan. Bake at 375 to 400 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes or until lightly browned, and serve immediately. Cornbread can be reheated and also freezes really well. The note here says this recipe comes from an old Rhode Island family cookbook with little direction. The white cornmeal, stone ground, was a staple in our early history and a gift from the local Narragansett Native Americans. If you like Johnny cakes, you'll like this, and it's much easier. Enjoy. I want to tell you about my friend Mike and his electromagnetic pinball museum and restoration arcade. It's an all-inclusive place to relax and share anything related to modern pinball and arcade games. A group of pinball and arcade fans with an addiction to games of all kinds and Lego too. $10 gets you free play on pinball and arcade games all day. You can find them at 881 Main Street, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or online at www.electromagneticpinballmuseum.com. And now, in our House on the Corner series, the finale of Under the Pyramids by H.P. Lovecraft for Harry Houdini. It was of these, of Kephren and his consort and his strange armies of the hybrid dead, that I dreamed. And that is why I am glad the exact dream shapes have faded from my memory. My most horrible vision was connected with an idle question I had asked myself on the day before when looking at the great carven riddle of the desert, and wondering with what unknown depths the temples so close to it might have been secretly connected. That question, so innocent and whimsical then, assumed in my dream a meaning of frenetic and hysterical madness. What huge and loathsome abnormality was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? My second awakening, if awakening it was, is a memory of stark hideousness which nothing else in my life, save one thing which came after, can parallel, and that life has been full and adventurous beyond most men's. Remember that I had lost consciousness whilst buried beneath a cascade of falling rope whose immensity revealed a cataclysmic depth of my present position. Now, as perception returned, I felt the entire weight gone and realized upon rolling over that although I was still tied, gagged, and blindfolded, some agency had removed completely the suffocating hempen landslide which had overwhelmed me. The significance of this condition, of course, came to me only gradually, but even so, I would think it would have brought unconsciousness again had I not by this time reached such a state of emotional exhaustion that no new horror could make such difference. I was alone. With what? Before I could torture myself with any new reflection or make any fresh effort to escape from my bonds, an additional circumstance became manifest. Pains not formerly felt were racking my arms and legs, and I seemed coated with a profusion of dried blood beyond anything my former cuts and abrasions could furnish. My chest, too, seemed pierced by 100 wounds, as though some malign, titanic ibis had been pecking at it. Assuredly, the agency which had removed the rope was a hostile one, and had begun to wreak terrible injuries upon me when somehow implied to desist. Yet at the time my sensations were distinctly the reverse of what one might expect. Instead of sinking into a bottomless pit of despair, I was stirred to a new courage and action. For now I felt the evil forces were physical things which a fearless man might encounter on an even basis. On the strength of this thought, I tugged again at my bonds and used all of the art of a lifetime to free myself, as I had so often done amongst the glare of lights and the applause of vast crowds. The familiar details of my escaping process commenced to engross me, and now that the long rope was gone, I half regained my belief that the supreme horrors were hallucinations after all, and that there had never been any terrible shaft, measureless abyss, or interminable rope. Was I after all in the gateway temple of Kefren beside the Sphinx? Were the sneaking men stolen in to torture me as I lay helpless there? At any rate, I must be free. Let me stand up, unbound, ungagged, and with eyes open, to catch any glimmer of light which may come trickling in from any source, and I could actually delight in the combat against evil and treacherous foes. How long I took in shaking off my encumbrances, I cannot tell. It must have been longer than in exhibition performances, because I was wounded, exhausted, and envenerated by the experiences I had passed through. When I was finally free and taking deep breaths of a chill, damp, evilly spiced air, all the more horrible when encountered without the screen of gag and blinded edges, I found that I was too cramped and fatigued to move at once. There I lay, trying to stretch a frame bent and mangled for an indefinite period, and straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of some ray of light which would give some hint as to my position. By degrees my strength and flexibility returned, but my eyes beheld nothing. As I staggered to my feet, I peered diligently in every direction, yet met only an ebony darkness as great as I had ever known when blindfolded. I tried my legs, blood encrusted beneath my shredded trousers, and found that I could walk, yet could not decide in what direction to go. Obviously, I ought not to walk at random, and perhaps retreat directly from the entrance I sought. so I paused to note the direction of the cold, fetid, natron-scented air current, which I had never ceased to feel, accepting the point of its source as the possible entrance to the abyss. I strove to keep track of this landmark and to walk consistently toward it. I had a matchbox with me and even a small electric flashlight, but of course the pockets of my tossed and tattered clothing were long since emptied of all heavy articles. As I walked cautiously in the blackness, the draft grew stronger and more offensive, till at length I could regard it as nothing less than a tangible stream of detestable vapor pouring out of some aperture like the smoke of a genie from the fisherman's jar in an Eastern tale. The East, Egypt, truly this dark cradle of civilization, was ever the wellspring of horrors and marvels unspeakable. The more I reflected on the nature of the cavern wind, the greater my sense of disquiet became. For although, despite its odor, I had sought its source as at least an indirect clue to the outside world, I now saw plainly that this foul emanation could have no admixture or connection whatsoever with the clean air of the Libyan desert, but must be essentially a thing vomited from sinister gulfs still lower down. I had, then, been walking in the wrong direction. After a moment's reflection, I decided not to retrace my steps. Away from the draft, I could have no landmarks, for the roughly level rock floor was devoid of distinctive configurations. If, however, I followed the strange current, I would undoubtedly arrive at an aperture of some sort, from whose gate I could perhaps work round the walls to the opposite side of this cyclopean and otherwise unnavigable hall. That I might fail, I well realized. I saw that this was no part of Khephrun's gateway temple which tourists knew, and it struck me that this particular hall might be unknown even to archaeologists, and merely stumbled upon by the inquisitive and malignant men who had imprisoned me. If so, was there any present gate of escape to the known parts or to the outer air? What evidence, indeed, did I now possess that this was some gateway temple at all? For a moment, all my wildest speculations rushed back upon me, and I thought of that vivid melange of impressions: descent, suspension in space, the ropes, my wounds, and the dreams that were frankly dreams. Was this the end of life for me? Or indeed, would it be merciful if this moment were the end? I could answer none of my own questions, but merely kept on, till fate, for a third time, reduced me to oblivion. This time there were no dreams, for the suddenness of the incident shocked me out of all thought, either conscious or subconscious. Tripping on an unexpected descending step at a point where the offensive draft became strong enough to offer an actual physical resistance, I was precipitated headlong down a black flight of huge stone stairs into a gulf of hideousness that I ever breathed again as a tribute to the inherent vitality of the healthy human organism. Often I look back at that night and feel a touch of actual humor in those repeated lapses of consciousness. Lapses whose succession reminded me at the time of nothing more than the crude cinema melodramas of the period. Of course, it is possible that the repeated lapses never occurred, and that all the features of that underground nightmare were merely the dreams of one long coma, which began with the shock of my descent into the abyss and ended with the healing balm of the outer air and the rising sun, which found me stretched on the sands of Giza before the sardonic and dawn-flushed face of the great Sphinx. I prefer to believe the latter explanation as much as I can, hence was glad when the police told me that the barrier to Khephrun's gateway temple had been found unfastened, and that a sizable rift to the surface did actually exist in one corner of the still buried part. I was glad, too, when the doctors pronounced my wounds only those to be expected from my seizure, blindfolding, lowering, struggling with bonds, falling some distance, perhaps into a depression in the temple's inner gallery, dragging myself to the outer barrier and escaping from it, and experiences like that. A very soothing diagnosis. And yet I know there must be more than appears on the surface. That extreme descent is too vivid a memory to be dismissed, and it is odd that no one has been able to find a man answering the description of my guide, Abdul Rees El Drogman, the tomb-throated guide who looked and smiled like King Khephren. I have digressed from my connected narrative, perhaps in the vain hope of evading the telling of that final incident, that incident which of all is most certainly a hallucination, but I promise to relate it and do not break promises. When I recovered, or seemed to recover, my senses after that fall down the black stone stairs, I was quite as alone in the darkness as before. The windy stench, bad enough before, was now fiendish. Yet I had acquired enough familiarity by this time to bear it stoically. Dazedly, I began to crawl away from the place whence the putrid wind came, and with my bleeding hands felt the colossal blocks of a mighty pavement. Once my head struck against a hard object, and when I felt it, I learned that it was the base of a column of unbelievable immensity, whose surface was covered with gigantic chiseled hieroglyphics, very perceptible to my touch. Crawling on, I encountered other Titan columns at incomprehensible distances apart, when suddenly my attention was captured by the realization of something which must have been impinging on my subconscious hearing long before the conscious sense was aware of it. From some still lower chasm in the earth's bowels were proceeding certain sounds, measured and definite, and like nothing I had ever heard before. That they were very ancient and distinctly ceremonial I felt intuitively, and much reading in Egyptology led me to associate them with the flute, the sambuke, the sistrum, and the tampunum. In their rhythmic piping, droning, rattling, and beating, I felt an element of terror beyond all known terrors of earth, a terror particularly disassociated from personal fear, and taking the form of some objective pity for our planet, that it should hold within its depths such horrors as must lie beyond these Aegypanic cacophonies. The sounds increased in volume, and I felt that they were approaching. Then, and may all the gods of all pantheons unite to keep the like from my ears again, I began to hear, faintly and afar off, the morbid and millennial tramping of the marching things. It was hideous that footfalls so dissimilar could move in such perfect rhythm. The training of unhallowed thousands of years must lie behind that march of Earth's innermost monstrosities. Padding, clicking, walking, stalking, rumbling, lumbering, crawling, and all to the abhorrent discords of those mocking instruments. And then, God, keep the memory of these legends out of my head. The mummies without souls, the meeting place of the wandering cause, the hordes of the devil-caused pharaonic dead of 40 centuries, the composite mummies led through the uttermost onyx voids by King Khephren and his ghoul queen, Nitocris. The tramping drew nearer. Heaven save me from the sound of those feet and paws and hooves and pads and talons as it commenced to acquire detail. Down limitless reaches of sunless pavement, a spark of light flickered on the malodorous wind, and I drew behind the enormous circumference of a cyclopean column that I might escape for a while the horror that was stalking, million-footed, toward me through gigantic hypostyles of inhuman dread and phobic antiquity. The flickers increased, and the tramping and dissident rhythm grew sickeningly loud. In the quivering orange light, there stood faintly forth a scene of such stony awe that I gasped in sheer wonder that conquered even fear and repulsion. Bases of columns whose middles were higher than human sight, mere bases of things that must each dwarf the Eiffel Tower in insignificance, hieroglyphics carved by unthinkable hands in caverns where daylight can only be a remote legend. I would not look at the marching things. That I desperately resolved as I heard their creaking joints and nitrous wheezing above the dead music and the dead tramping. It was merciful that they did not speak, but God, their crazy torches began to cast shadows on the surface of those stupendous columns. Heaven take it away. Hippopotami should not have human hands and carry torches. Men should not have the heads of crocodiles. I tried to turn away, but the shadows and the sounds and the stench were everywhere. Then I remembered something I used to do, half-conscious nightmares as a boy, and began to repeat to myself, "This is a dream. This is a dream." But it was of no use, and I could only shut my eyes and pray. At least, that is what I think I did. For no one is ever sure in visions, and I know this can have been nothing more. I wondered whether I should ever reach the world again, and at times would furtively open my eyes to see if I could discern any feature of the place other than the wind of spiced putrefaction, the topless columns, and the thermotropically grotesque shadows of abnormal horror. The sputtering glare of multiplying torches now shone, and unless this hellish place were wholly without walls, I could not fail to see some boundary or fixed landmarks soon. But I had to shut my eyes again when I realized how many of the things were assembling, and when I glimpsed a certain object walking solemnly and steadily without any body above the waist. A fiendish and ululent corpse gurgle or death rattle now split the very atmosphere, the charnel atmosphere poisonous with naphtha and bitumen blasts, in one concerted chorus from the ghoulish legion of hybrid blasphemies. My eyes, perversely shaken open, gazed for an instant upon a sight which no human creature could even imagine without panic, fear, and physical exhaustion. The things had filed ceremonially in one direction, the direction of the noisome wind. Where the light of their torches showed their bended heads, or the bended heads as such had heads, they were worshipping before a great black fetter-belching aperture which reached up almost out of sight, and which I could see was flanked at right angles by two giant staircases, whose ends were far away in shadow. One of these was indubitably the staircase I had fallen down. The dimensions of the whole were fully in proportion with those of the columns. An ordinary house would have been lost in it, and any average public building would easily be moved in and out. It was so vast a surface that only by moving the eye could one trace its boundaries. So vast, so hideously black, and so aromatically stinking. Directly in front of this yawning Palamefius door, the things were throwing objects, evidently sacrifices or religious offerings, to judge by their gestures. Kefren was their leader, sneering King Kefren, or the guide Abdul Rees, crowned with a golden fencht and intoning endless formulae in the hollow voice of the dead. By his side knelt beautiful Queen Tokris, whom I saw in profile for a moment, noting that the right half of her face was eaten away by rats or other ghouls. And I shut my eyes again when I saw what objects were being thrown as offerings to the fetid aperture or its possible local deity. It occurred to me that, judging from the elaborateness of this worship, the concealed deity must be one of considerable importance. Was it Osiris or Isis, Horus or Anubis, or some vast unknown god of the dead still more central and supreme? There was a legend that terrible altars and colossi were reared to an unknown one before ever the known gods were worshipped. And now, as I steeled myself to watch the rapt and sepulchral adorations of those nameless things, a thought of escape flashed upon me. The hall was dim, and the columns heavy with shadow, With every creature of that nightmare throng absorbed in shocking raptures, it might be barely possible for me to creep past to the far-away end of one of the staircases and ascend unseen, trusting to fate and skill to deliver me to the upper reaches. Where I was, I neither knew nor seriously reflected upon, and for a moment it struck me as amusing to plan a serious escape from which I knew to be a dream. Was I in some hidden or unsuspected lower realm of Khephren Gateway Temple, that temple which generations have persistently called the Temple of the Sphinx? I could not conjecture, but I resolved to ascend to life and consciousness if wit and muscle could carry me. Wriggling flat on my stomach, I began the anxious journey toward the foot of the left-hand staircase, which seemed the more ascendable of the two. I could not describe the incidents and sensations of that crawl, but they may be guessed when one's reflect of what I had to watch steadily in that malign, wind-blown torchlight in order to avoid detection. The bottom of the staircase was, as I have said, far away in shadow, as it had to be able to rise without a bend to the dizzy, parapeted landing above the titanic aperture. This placed the last stages of my crawl at some distance from the noisome herd, though the spectacle chilled me, even when quite remote at my right. At length, I succeeded in reaching the steps and began to climb, keeping close to the wall, on which I observed decorations of the most hideous sort, and relying for safety on the absorbed ecstatic interest with the monstrosities watched the foul-breezed aperture and the impious objects of nourishment that they had flung on the pavement before it. Though the staircase was huge and steep, fashioned of vast porphyry blocks as if the feet of a giant, the ascent seemed virtually interminable. Dread of discovery and the pain with renewed exercise which brought to my wounds combined to make that upward crawl a thing of agonizing memory. I had intended, on reaching the landing, to climb immediately onward along whatever upper staircase might mount from there, stopping for no last look at the carrion abominations that pawed and genuflected some 70 or 80 feet below. Yet, a sudden repetition of that thunderous corpse gurgle and death rattle chorus, coming as I nearly gained at the top of the flight and showed its ceremonial rhythm that it was not an alarm of my discovery, caused me to pause and peer cautiously over the parapet. The monstrosities were hailing something which had poked itself out of the nauseous aperture to seize the hellish fare proffered it. It was something quite ponderous, even as seen from my height, something yellowish and hairy, and endowed with a sort of nervous motion. It was as large, perhaps, as a good-sized hippopotamus, but very curiously shaped. It seemed to have no neck, but 5 separate shaggy heads springing out in a row from a roughly cylindrical trunk. The first very small, the second good-sized, the third and fourth equal and largest of all, and the fifth rather small, though not as small as the first. Out of these heads darted curious rigid tentacles which seized ravenously on the excessively great quantities of unmentionable food placed before the aperture. Once in a while the thing would leap up, and occasionally it would retreat into its den in a very odd manner. Its locomotion was so inexplicable that I stared in fascination, wishing that it would emerge further from the cavernous lair beneath me. Then it did emerge. It did emerge, and at the sight I turned and fled into the darkness up the higher staircase that rose behind me, fled unknowingly up incredible steps and ladders and inclined planes to which no human sight or logic guided me, and which I may ever relegate to the world of dreams for want of any confirmation. It must have been a dream, or the dawn would never have found me breathing on the sands of Giza before the sardonic, dawn-flushed face of the Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx! God! That idle question I had asked myself on the sun-blessed morning before. What huge and loathsome abnormality was the Sphinx originally carven to represent? Accursed is the sight, be it in dream or not, that revealed to me the supreme horror, the unknown god of the dead, which licks its colossal chops in the unsuspected abyss, fed hideous morsels by soulless absurdities that should not exist. The five-headed monster that emerged, that five-headed monster as large as a hippopotamus, the five-headed monster, and that of which merest forepaw. But I survived, and I know it was only a dream. Thank you once again for joining us today at the Pawtuxet General. If you would like to reach out with a question, comment, local ghost story, or an order for the pop-up general store, our email is jess@pawtuxetgeneral.com. We can't wait to hear from you, but until then, I'll meet you right back here next time at the Pawtuxet General. Something for Posterity production, pre-recorded in Pawtuxet.